All right, folks, we'll get started real quick with just a couple of announcements. Can you give me a thumbs up? Everybody get that announcement this morning for research stuff. Okay, cool. Make sure that you go through and read that carefully. Sonar system stuff is pretty straightforward. Just go through, make sure that you enter CLAP Psych 1000. My wife is teaching a different course on intellectual disabilities. Sometimes at the end of the semester, people who have credits who are supposed to go to this class end up going to her. So just make sure you get signed up for the right class. If you have a Sona account before, if you were in a different class where you participated in research, you can still use the same account. It'll still be in there. That's actually kind of a good idea. It just helps from getting things kind of turned around. But what you'll have to do is you'll have to go in, reset this as the class that you're wanting to get credits for, and the pre-screener is up. So you can get on that. You can complete that whenever you like over the course of the next couple of weeks. That'll be important. And then also, there's going to be studies that don't require you to have like that pre-screening data. So they're just kind of open to everybody. There's no exclusion criteria for those. And you can start picking those up right now. Those are going to start coming online. So if you're looking for studies, and there's not a lot on there right now, that's fine. That's just because we need to go through these first couple of weeks, get the pre-screener out of the way, but just kind of keep on the ball and just kind of keep checking that. And if you run into questions, problems, or anything like that, just let me know. Okay. Any questions about research stuff or what we're trying to do with that, where that's going, anything along those lines? Okay, cool. Yeah, it's just a big chunk of your grade. Again, if you're a little bummed out by performance on the first quiz, that's all right. That happens, no worries. But this research is going to be a big boost for that. So just make sure that you're on top of that. And if you really want to play it safe, just max out with 9 credits, because that's what I'll credit you up to with extra credit going above and beyond the 6. Okay, cool. All right, so let's jump into... share our screen here. We finished up with, we'll start here. All right. So last time we were talking about, we talked about some neurons, how neurons work, interesting stuff. Then we started getting broken into our nervous system. And so again, remember, if you got nervous system at the top, nervous system breaks into 2 main branches. First is your central nervous system. This is your brain and spinal cord. This is the stuff that's important for keeping you alive and sort of regulating your body. So to need to make sure the central nervous system is protected, bone, meninges, sort of multiple layers of protection with your central nervous system. Okay, so central nervous system, brain and spinal cord. Then we talked about the other branches being your peripheral nervous system. Peripheral nervous system, this is responsible for carrying information from the outside world into your brain and from taking commands from your brain into sort of your body so you can go and talk and do and interact and do those types of things. Okay, but what we have, the peripheral nervous system, is then split into 2 different branches. Okay, your first is your somatic nervous system. So first branch of the peripheral nervous system is the somatic nervous system. This is going to regulate your skeletal muscles, your joints, your sort of muscles. So me doing all of this right now, this is voluntary activity. So anything that you're doing, moving around in the universe or making your body move in a specific way, this is generally going to involve your skeletal muscles. This is voluntary. So this is your somatic nervous system. Other branch of your nervous system is your autonomic nervous system. Autonomic nervous system goes through and regulates your organs, different glands, and things along these lines. This is the stuff that keeps your body alive. Okay, so Keely, I'm looking at you right now because you're in my screen. Your heart is beating, I'm assuming, unless you're a weird zombie vampire or something like that, right? You're not thinking about making your heart beat right now, right? That's happening on its own. This is a function of your autonomic nervous system. Cade, I assume that your stomach is processing food and digesting things. Your sort of organs are working as they should, fingers crossed, right? Like this is all stuff going on that's part of your autonomic nervous system, right? So we've got our central and our peripheral. Peripheral breaks into somatic, autonomic. Okay. Questions about these two branches here? Okay. Then finally, your autonomic nervous system. This then breaks into two different branches. Shut up, phone. Autonomic nervous system, two branches here is going to be your sympathetic division of your autonomic nervous system, your sympathetic nervous system, and your parasympathetic nervous system. Okay, sympathetic nervous system. Someone tell me what the sympathetic nervous system does.
Isn't it kind of like your flight or fight response?
Yeah, that's exactly. So if we were all together and it was a normal semester and I was hanging out with you all, I'd be like hanging out at the front of class, and then I'd suddenly scream like a banshee, and that would get like some of you to go through and jump and have a reaction. And I'm not going to scream into my microphone. I don't think it would be as effective, but sort of it's a nice demonstration. Startle is a great demonstration for as soon as you do that, something comes out unexpected, you startle, right? And your heart rate increases and your pupils dilate. Basically, in this slide, you don't have to worry about knowing sort of what all these things do. That's not important. This is just kind of an example. But basically, your sympathetic nervous system is your fight or flight. In general, your body just is preparing itself for survival mode. Okay? So if you think about things that are going on the sympathetic list, these are things that are important if you're about ready to get eaten by a bear, right? Pupils dilate, let in more light. Your body inhibits saliva production. I don't need to digest food if I'm about ready to be eaten, right? Dilates my bronchi. My lungs are able to go through, take in more air. My heart rate goes up. I'm dumping adrenaline and norepinephrine and things like that into my body, stimulating release of glucose so my muscles have energy to go through and run or fight or things along these lines, right? So this is your sympathetic nervous system. Your parasympathetic, you can think about this. If you're a physiology major, you'll go through and recognize that these aren't sort of necessarily opposing systems. They sort of work in concert in a lot of different ways. But for the purposes of our study, of our class, thinking about your parasympathetic division as something that activates for I'm safe. I'm good. Think about like at post Thanksgiving meal. This is where your parasympathetic system is coming in, promoting rest, digestion, things along these lines. Parasympathetic division says I'm safe, I'm comfortable, I'm adapting. I don't need to be sort of right in the middle of getting out of here. So if we look at contracting pupils because you're cool, you're safe, you don't need to let in a lot of light, stimulating saliva for digestion, heart slowing down, sort of stimulating digestive muscles and things along those lines. Stimulates urination. I can pee, right? If I don't have to run for my life, right? They can take time to use the bathroom, things like that. This is your parasympathetic division here. Okay. So again, questions about the two branches. Again, don't worry. I'm not going to ask you to sort of tell me what the liver does if the sympathetic activation system is activated. Just kind of know kind of what's going on here. Okay. All right. So this is I sketched out, but a nice thing because this could start to get tricky, right? So remember, we've got our nervous system. We separate this into central, peripheral. We separate into somatic, autonomic. We separate into our sympathetic, parasympathetic. So just a nice way to try and keep these systems organized so that you know what goes where with things. Okay. All right. So lecture summary slides here. Make sure to read through that. Comprehension check slides. Again, if you can go through and answer these without looking at your notes, if you can explain this to your grandma or your roommate, you'll know that you'll have this material pretty well covered with things. All right. Any questions about this stuff on neurological systems? Cool. All righty. So we'll X out of that. We'll switch over to brain stuff. All right. So there's your brain in all its glory. What we want to start with brain things is starting to sort of work through some basic geography. Again, if you've had like AP classes, or if you're a physiology major or bio stuff, this is probably going to be a lot of review. Just make sure that you're square on all of this information. If we take a look at a brain, right, and this is sort of this stereotypical brain, looking at it a couple different directions. Here we're looking at it from the side, here from the back, here from the top down. We see sort of the brain sort of set up here into two different lobes, right? We got two different hemispheres. We've got the right hemisphere, we've got the left hemisphere. And in general, these hemispheres are relatively symmetrical. So if we went through and split your brain right down the center, which we'll actually talk about studies where this has been done, we've got our right, we've got our left, and what we see is some degree of specialized functioning in the right and the left hemisphere. Not maybe to the extent that people will sometimes think, but in general, we see that right hemisphere does some a little bit different things than the left hemisphere, or specializes better. Can someone tell me sort of distinction between right and left hemisphere? Or sort of in general strengths of your right versus your left hemisphere? Okay, yeah. Jonathan, you're on the right track. So what you were talking about there is what's interesting when we're talking about brain stuff, and this will start to get tricky, is contralateral functioning, right? So Jonathan, raise your right hand. Okay, what hemisphere of your brain was in charge of raising your right hand? The left side, right? The somatosensory, sort of the motor portions of your left hemisphere for raising your right hand. Wink your left eye. There we go. It was subtle. I saw it. You got a sharp wink on you. Yeah, that was motor stuff in the right side of your, whoops, here we go. Left eye, right side of your brain, right? So going through, and so we see contralateral functioning with a lot of the different processes we're seeing is that one side is controlling the opposite side of the body. So there's a crisscross there. We also see some degree of specialization. What we see is your left hemisphere starts to become more dominant for most people in terms of processing and analyzing information. Okay, so thinking about your left hemisphere being better and maybe doing more of the heavy lifting in terms of things like math and language and sort of this type of analytic types of things. Okay, that tends to be stuff that goes on more in your left hemisphere, and we'll see this particularly with language. Language is highly specialized in the left hemisphere. If you get damage to your left hemisphere, in some areas you likely will have some difficulties with language, and we'll see some examples of that. Right hemisphere does a much better job, or sort of tends to be involved in the synthesis of information, integration, right? So if I'm looking at a landscape or looking out, sort of the sort of integration of that information coming together. Right hemisphere, people will say, "Oh, I'm a left brain, right brain type of person." That's a gross simplification of how it actually works, but there is some specialization in the right and left hemisphere. Okay. All right. So we've got our hemispheres 1 and 2, and these operate relatively independently. We'll see some examples of this in this unit. But if we look at the topography of the brain, we see these these grooves in the brain, right? That's kind of the characteristic feature of the brain. We go through and we see these crevices, these grooves. These grooves, the little grooves, are called sulci. Okay, these are the little grooves and indentations, sulci on the brain. The raised areas, kind of the bumps that looks like kind of like bread dough that's been pushed together. These are the gyri. Okay, and if we go through and we take a look what happens, we'll talk about this in your cortex is actually quite large. If we were to flatten out your cortex, it would be pretty big. And when we go through and we squish it all up into your skull, we get grooves and raises. And again, the grooves, here we see a gyrus, right? So it's something that pops up. The sulci are the little grooves there. Okay. And then we also have fissures. Fissures are the big sort of subdivisions of the brain. This is how we go through and map things out, and we'll say, well, it's sort of higher than this or lower than this, but we use better biology terms than that. But your fissures are your major landmarks. So your sulci, little grooves, fissures, big deviations there in your brain. Okay. Questions about basic geography stuff? All right, cool. So we're going to talk about your brain in lecture, split it up a little bit different than Myers does. I just think this is a kind of an easier way to think about things, kind of gives us some structure. We're going to talk about three major divisions of the brain today. First is going to be your forebrain. Okay, first is your cerebral cortex. That's the outside that everybody knows and loves. That's the brain we recognize. That's part of your forebrain. But then underneath that, if we looked underneath that sort of cap, that mushroom cap of your cerebral cortex, we'd find some structures, some subcortical structures that are still part of your forebrain. This is your basal ganglia, your limbic system, your thalamus, hypothalamus, some of these features. And so your forebrain, you can think about your forebrain as the newest and improved part of your brain, right? If we go back from an evolutionary standpoint, your forebrain is the newest, most recent, more complex type of thing. Allows us to do a lot of things that sort of make us considerably more advanced than rodents and bugs and other creatures. Okay, so we think about that. If we go back in time, we get to the midbrain. There's a lot of other structures in the midbrain. We're just going to work on your reticular formation. Has to do with attention and sort of some gating types of stuff. And then we're going to get down back into the hindbrain. Think about this as your old sort of basic like lizard brain types of structures, your cerebellum, your pons, your medulla, and we will. Here we go. I got people. Oh, awesome. You guys are helping each other out. Nice work. I just pulled out the text there. Hindbrain being your oldest portion of your brain. Okay, so think about sort of forebrain, midbrain, hindbrain, just as a way to kind of keep some of these structures organized in your brain. All right. So talking about the forebrain. Forebrain, going to start with your cerebral cortex. Your cerebral cortex is that folded structure on the outside. When we take a look at the brain, this is what we see. Your cerebral cortex is your newest and sort of most advanced structure. Your cerebral cortex is about 3 millimeters thick. So if we took a brain and took the cortex off and kind of flattened it out, we would see that it's about 3 millimeters thick. And what we see is about 2/3 of the total surface area of your cortex is hidden in within the fissures and the sulci of your brain. Okay, so why does this happen? Why do we see basically the most of the surface area of your brain is kind of tucked in within these different folds? What does that folding of the brain allow us to do, or what advantage does that confer?
Minimizes space.
It minimizes space, yeah. In that it's a better use of space, right? So if you think about because your cortex is really pretty thin, right? Not very thin at all, or not very thick at all. But what we do is if we go through and we have a kind of a think about your cortex as kind of like a cookie dough baking sheet. It's going to be pretty big. What we do if we kind of smash it in and sort of bunch it up, it's going to create a bunch of folds, but it gets more cortex in your skull cap here so that we can go through and have greater complexity of neurons and things along those lines, more connections and things along those lines. So absolutely right. It's kind of like a a space-saving issue, okay? But what this cortex is, it's again, I talked about this, it's kind of like a mushroom cap, right? So if you think about a mushroom and sort of got the cap on top, that's kind of like your cortex, okay? And if we were to pop that cortex off, we see that the top of the cortex, talk about this as your gray matter. This is mostly soma. What is the soma of a neuron?
The cell body, basically.
Yep, exactly, Daniel. This is your cell body, right? So this is kind of the sort of the body of your cell with all the sort of mechanisms and stuff like that. And so that's what we're seeing right here. If we take a look at this guy, what we're seeing is mostly this is all your gray matter. This is basically cell bodies of your cortex. But if we were to pop that cortex off, what we would see underneath would see the white matter. This is where your axons from all the sort of cell bodies kind of protruding down, which makes sense. There's no reason to send axons up into the top of my skull because there's nothing else going on up here, right? So what we see is this white matter, which is the neurons of, or the axons of your individual neurons sort of going down and making connections in the subcortical structures. And so this is going to be your white matter. Okay. Now, one thing, and I would say is if you take one thing for just general knowledge about psychology and how the human brain works to take off into the universe from this lecture, we want to think about, what sort of area this section of the brain does this, or these neurons do X, which there's some stuff that you can do sort of thinking about in that way. But again, your brain is very, very, very complicated. There's a lot of different things, and sort of the connection between what my brain's doing, electrical activity and the biology going on in my brain, and how that relates to sort of psychology, thoughts, feelings, behaviors, and things like that is incredibly complicated, right? And what we see is that very rarely do we see like a one-to-one correlation between this area of the brain just does this one thing in terms of an observable behavior, right? So think about a better way to think about this is brain regions being involved in certain types of things, okay? And we know this from a lot of different research and a lot of people who have had damage to certain parts of their brain. We know if we knock out certain parts of the brain, people tend to have difficulties in certain areas, right? But instead of thinking about this as this part of the brain does this thing, thinking about parts of the brain as being involved, right? So do we have any mechanics in the audience here? Let's say I got an old truck. I go out to my old truck and it won't start, right? And so I go through and I clean out the carburetor, and so it gets gas, and now it starts again, right? Does the carburetor make the truck run? Is the running of the truck located in the carburetor? No. Carburetor is just one piece that then contribute. Now, if it's screwed up, it's going to cause problems, right? But sort of the life of my car, the essence of my car is not living in the carburetor, right? It's just a piece of a larger whole. Think about your brain regions as that, and don't get too upset if we see, this lobe and that lobe, they're doing the same thing. That's fine, right? It's an integrated system, which is good, right? Because if I have damage to one area and that's the only area that does stuff, basically we would say my biology has put all my eggs in one basket. That's not a good system, right? I might not be great at something, but there may be other regions that help to sort of join in with stuff, okay? So just keep that in mind as we're talking about different regions of the brain, what they do in terms of function and things like that. So if we're looking at and thinking about our cortex here, first big area right here is going to be the frontal lobe, okay? Frontal lobe is crucial for regulating your behavior, for planning aspects of speech and movement going on here, right? So your frontal lobe does a lot of different things, but really if I go through and I sort of have a head injury and damage my frontal lobes, it's very likely that I'm going to have problems with attention. And maybe if that damage has been pretty severe, regulating different parts of my behavior. When we talked about Phineas Gage, what part in the story of Phineas Gage, when that bar went cruising up through the top of his head, what part of the brain do people think was probably most damaged by that injury?
His personality.
Yeah, his personality and the frontal lobe stuff, right? So this is where all the foresight, the planning, and that type of stuff takes place. If I knock out your frontal lobe, you're going to have a hard time doing a lot of different things, sort of regulating your behavior, okay? But also some speech, movement, other types of things going on there in your frontal lobe. Okay. Your temporal lobe. These are the folks going on. And again, you've got lobes on each side. So you've got two frontal lobes. You've got a right frontal and you've got a left frontal. You've got a left temporal, a right temporal. Temporal is huge for speech, okay? there's some speech going on in the frontal lobe, but temporal lobe, lots of speech going on, some different smells being processed there, some hearing being processed in your temporal lobe. These are going on right here. Also have your parietal lobe. This is like the lobe everybody forgets. Parietal lobe is up here on the top. We got a parietal lobe on the left, or right, parietal lobe on the left. Parietal lobe, a lot of sensory information, okay? Right now, if you sort of rub your hands on your face, right, like the feel of your skin and sort of what's going on, a lot of that is being processed up here in your parietal lobe. We also see parietal lobe involved in some processing of taste, and again, processing of speech. Speech is super complex, so it's kind of spread out in different regions of the brain. So some of that going on in the parietal. And then your occipital, back here, again, your right occipital lobe, your left occipital lobe, back here, this is a lot of vision stuff. We tend to think about occipital as vision. If I get hit on the back of the head, I start seeing stars, right? It's not that my eyes are processing stuff coming in from the back. What I've done is I've literally, like, jarred around these neurons back there, and they start firing, right, which results in sort of the experience of light, okay? So in general, just kind of know what these general lobes are kind of doing, sort of where they're positioned and things along those lines. But don't get too worked up because speech is in 3 of the 4 lobes that we're talking about here. Questions about the cortex?
I have like a concussion happens.
Okay, yeah.
That's bleeding in the brain, right?
Concussion, I think, is just sort of getting bounced around a little bit. I don't think sort of concussion necessarily requires, but if I like smack my head and I kind of got my air sac around my brain, but if that gets sort of bounced around, we can talk about that as a concussion. Yeah.
Okay.
Was that it, Julia?
Yeah, I was just like curious how it if it like affected anything, like or if it depends where you got hit or like the occipital.
Yep. And so what you'll see is people with certain types of brain damage. If I have specific trauma to my occipital lobe, what can happen is I may develop a vision impairment, but it's not because my eyes don't work. It's because the sort of lobe that's supposed to be processing that got all scrambled up, and so you can start to see interesting stuff going on there. Yep.
Can some blindness or vision issues be caused by the nerves coming from the eyes and not the brain or the eyes themselves?
Yeah. I mean, so all of that stuff. I mean, you think it like any system, right? If I go through and I have a breakdown at any point sort of along the chain, that is going to cause some problems. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
When they used to do lobotomies.
Oh boy.
Yes, when they would tear up the frontal lobe, that's when, because they thought the frontal lobe dealt with personality, correct?
Yeah. And we'll talk about that when we get to the end of in an advanced class, I'd sort of did pictures of the ice pick lobotomy and stuff like that. And basically it's just scrambling up your frontal lobes, which can go a lot of different ways, right? It's not wasn't an overly precise procedure, right? And so to basically, you turn someone into a zombie functionally, right? If I'm sort of have a lot of sort of behavior that's sort of disruptive and things like that, and sort of one flew over the cuckoo's nest type of thing, like that stuff used to happen, right? Like this is someone who's a problem, and so we're going to deem them crazy and then give them a lobotomy, chop out part of their brain. And now they're pretty docile and they don't move around a whole lot, So yeah, there's a really nasty history in clinical psychology and psychiatry with that type of stuff. So thankfully there are things in place to try and make sure that doesn't happen. Yeah.
If there are, like someone is born with a speech impairment,
Uh-huh. Speech is super, super complicated. And I'm not a speech language person. We've got a great program at the university where it gets into that. But speech is complicated. Like sometimes if I get damage to my left temporal, that can cause some problems with speech. But generally, there are other things going on with like speech impediments and stutters and things like that. Sometimes it's structural. So probably not a brain issue so much as sort of some other stuff in a lot of cases. Yeah. All right. All right.
Doesn't like the focus areas
What
affect the speech?
what's that? What's that, Sage?
Doesn't like the focus area affect the speech? Is that what it's called? Or am I
Yeah. We'll get to some of those, like the Broca and Wernicke areas and stuff like that. Yeah, depending on if we get damage to certain parts of the brain, we start to see very specific changes in behavior and some deficits like that, which is pretty interesting. And we'll hit that at the end of this lecture. Yeah, cool. All right. So here are our cortices, right? So these are the different pieces and parts. Okay. One thing, sort of area that's sort of interesting. Well, it's all interesting, but sort of particular area. If we're thinking about our sense of, or our ability to move and our ability to sort of feel sensations and things along these lines, what you have here on your frontal lobe and your parietal lobe, two bands that run. Again, you've got a left hemisphere or right hemisphere, left hemisphere. And so on the back side of your frontal lobe, you've got a motor cortex that runs along the back side of your frontal lobe. And so we've got one on the right and one on the left. And then right behind that, on the front of the parietal, we have a somatosensory cortex that runs, again, one on the left, one on the right. Okay. And these two portions of the brain, highlighted here, your motor cortex regulates your muscle movement. So sort of me doing sort of all this, it's a lot of hand gesticulating here because I'm sitting down and instead of being in front of you in a lecture hall. But we've got that. And then our sensory cortex, or our somatosensory cortex, this is integrating sensory information. And what's really interesting about sort of these areas is we see that in these cortices, specific neurons and groups of neurons are tied in with specific parts of the body, okay? And so if we can go through, if we look at a map like this, we can see that we can actually map out on the brain where different, so if this is your motor cortex, what different neurons are controlling in terms of your sort of body out there, right? So if I were to look at and be recording brain activity as you were talking, sort of moving your face around, we'd see this area light up. Here's tongue, swallowing, sort of elbow, wrist, fingers, and stuff like that. Same thing on your sensory cortex. So your ability to feel information or feel textures and sort of heat and pressure and sort of these types of things, again, mapping on where we've got very specific neurons in this area starting to correspond to sort of different areas of your body. Okay, so if you were in sort of brain surgery and like sort of in movies, right? Like I go through and I poke the area of your brain that controls your elbow, maybe you sort of move your elbow type of thing, right? But what's interesting when we go through and map out these neurons is the number of neurons that are dedicated to individual body parts seem to be relatively proportional to either the level of dexterity or the sensitivity of that body part, right? And so what we see is that in your motor cortex, the space developed or dedicated to your face and lips and tongue, stuff that's important for speech and a lot of complex movements, kind of your fingers and your hands that do things, a lot more real estate is developed to those than to things like my hip. I mean, my hip kind of moves around, but doesn't move around. My hips don't move around a whole lot. I'm not a good dancer. But in things like knees and your ankles and things like that, right? Relatively few neurons dedicated to those that have kind of relatively gross movement versus areas that have of your musculature that are much more complex. Same thing with your sensory, somatosensory cortex. Things that are, if I'm sort of touching my lips, right? Your lips are very, very sensitive to any type of thing. If you touch your elbow's not super sensitive to much of anything, right? I can pinch my elbow and it doesn't really hurt. There's not much going on there, right? And so what we see is an interesting situation where proportionally, neurologically, biologically, structurally, we see more neurons devoted to more complex areas in terms of motor and sensory stuff than we do to other places, right? And so what we'll see when we take a look, if you were to look at yourself as your brain looks at yourself, right, in terms of like how much resources are we devoted to certain areas, it looks very different than sort of maybe how we would see ourselves. If anybody's seen this, so this is the stereotypical homunculus, right? And so for motor movement stuff, right, this could be sort of in terms of representativeness, how your brain kind of views you. Sort of big old hands, big lips, big tongue, right? So these are things that sort of are sort of dedicated a lot of complexity in terms of neurons developed to do these things, versus my legs and toes and things like that. There's not much, those don't move around a whole lot, so relatively less. Okay. And other thing to remember with these motor cortex, the somatic sensory cortex, as we noted before, contralateral functioning here. Okay, so my right side of my body here is all controlled by neurons on my left motor cortex over here. My left hand, everything going on my left side, impacted by the motor cortex, or controlled by the motor cortex on my right hemisphere. So we've got a cross. Same thing. Anything that I'm feeling on my desk right now with my right hand being processed in the sensory cortex of my left hemisphere, same thing on the other side. So we got this this crossover function here, and we refer to that as just contralateral functioning. Okay. Yeah.
Is there an idea or a theory for why the portion of the brain controls the opposite body part?
I'm not sure. This has come up before. I haven't been able to find anything about sort of what, like, the theoretical advantages for that contralateral, for that sort of switched. I don't know. And so it could be, I don't know. I'll look again and see if I can find anything. Has anybody heard of any sort of evolutionary or sort of mechanical advantage of having a crossed system like that?
Well, I know a little bit about that.
Yeah.
So it's just, it kind of talks to that diversification. Like if you look on a functional MRI of like sensory uptake of someone touching your left foot, like it'll mostly go to the right side of your brain, but it will also activate a portion of your left hemisphere.
Okay.
So it just goes back to that like diversity of processing region. But right, like why it's, that speaks to why both hemispheres pick it up, but it doesn't necessarily speak to why the response is so much greater on one side.
Okay.
But that informs it a little bit.
Yeah. So again, sort of one of these systems, like Heidi's saying, right? Like, so if I have damage and it cuts out a sort of a piece of sort of my brain, it's bad news. It's not great, right? But hopefully there's some other sort of areas kind of processing information. But yeah, and it'll start to get, when we start to look at vision and stuff like that, there's crossing and back crossing and things along those lines. It gets pretty tricky. But just be aware that for most of the sensory stuff like that we're talking, it tends to be contralateral in nature. Yeah. All right. So some other cortices, again, just to kind of sort of give you an idea of like other areas of the brain that have kind of specific functions, or people have studied quite a bit. Prefrontal cortex. Prefrontal cortex is important. Again, this is sort of where a lot of regulation, inhibition, executive functioning, attention types of things are going on here. If I get in a car accident and bounce my head off a steering wheel, it bruises up or jars around that prefrontal cortex, probably. And Julia, you had mentioned concussions, right? A lot of times, when we see people who have had concussive events, attention is a big thing that people struggle with. A lot of that attention stuff is going on in prefrontal cortex area here, right? Here's your motor cortex, your somatosensory cortex. Here's your primary auditory cortex. Okay, this is going hanging out right here at the top of your temporal lobe. This is helping you process sound information and things along those lines. And then your visual cortex back here, this is doing processing of visual information. Not all of it. Your occipital is where we do some sort of initial rough processing, and then things get sent off to other regions to go through and do some fine-tuned stuff. So just kind of eyeball this, kind of know just where basic things are laid out, and you'll be good to go with this. All right. So I'm not sure exact. So normally what we would do is we watch a video about some stuff here in class, and it would be fine. I've been made aware that there are weird rules on YouTube on what I can post and what I can't post and things like that. So, and also right now my sound isn't sort of working on this well, so you probably couldn't hear it even if I played it. I'll give you the links to talk about some of these, or so that you can go through and watch some of these different clips on your own time while I try and figure out how we incorporate that into our lecture video. But what we do know, right, is that, and through some special cases, some case studies and things that have happened in reoccurring injuries and things along these lines, when we have cases where people have had parts of their brain damaged, what we start to see in certain areas is some kind of stereotypical or typical types of deficits in observable behavior. Okay, and so we do this as a long history of case studies in medicine and psychology. So taking people who have had sort of very, very unique types of difficulties and trying to tie those back to specific brain regions. Okay, and so if we use some speech stuff as an example, because again, speech is super developed in humans, but it's very, very complex. In different case studies, what we've found is there's certain areas of speech that are certain areas of the brain that start to go through and impact certain aspects of speech. So one area that's received a lot of attention is called Broca's area, or Broca's area. And this is on your left frontal lobe. Okay, Broca's area here located on your left frontal. And what we see with individuals who have had very, very, very specific damage to Broca's area here, developing a condition known as Broca's aphasia. Aphasia is just any sort of deficit in speech. And what we see here is an impairment in expressive speech. Okay, and so what we get is individuals like our young woman here who were fine before, but then have damage to this area of Broca's area, and all of a sudden their speech starts to become very halting and slow, and particularly difficult with word finding and difficulties with non-content words. So my speech is not terribly fluent. I sort of jump around all over the place, right? But these connecting words that tie our language together and say this, that, and the other thing, here's this happening. Folks with Broca's aphasia, and you'll see this when you go through and watch this video on your own, will see some word finding issues, but really it's the fluency of the speech that starts to become problematic. And what you'll see is in this video, she'll be able to write down words, and that will help her verbalize these words. But it's the connecting thing that starts to become difficult for her. Okay, so what we see with this is a problem with expressive speech. Right? I know what I want to say. The words are in my head. It's just making these words come out in a way that someone can go through and understand. Okay. And this is really dumb because usually then I would sort of have you watch this, but I don't want to get thrown off of YouTube. And my mic's hooked up so it wouldn't play sort of audio anyway. But I'll send you links for you guys to take a look at that on your own. Okay.
Dr. Clapp,
Yeah.
would patients with Broca's aphasia have issues with writing or reading?
No, and that's the thing. And so what you'll see which is really interesting with these aphasias, because they're very specific. And so individuals with these difficulties, they can write, right? It's expressive language in terms of written or sort of spoken language that cause problems. And so you'll see when you watch her, she's got sort of the interviewers asking her questions, and she'll sometimes write things down and then sort of look and then sort of go through and talk from there. So yeah, it's spoken language primarily with Broca's aphasia. which is different than Wernicke's aphasia. Okay, so again, an area here, this time an area in the left temporal lobe. Okay, and what we see with individuals who have had damage to Wernicke's area, so very close to Broca's area, but sort of different. Now we're on the left temporal, and what we see is individuals in this case have impairment and difficulties with both expressive speech and language comprehension. Okay, so when you watch these videos of very, very, very different types of difficulties with language, in Wernicke's or in Broca's aphasia, we see halting speech, people difficulty finding words and connecting things together, and it's I just can't sort of get going. Wernicke's aphasia, speech holds its natural cadence. People are talking like I'm talking here. I'm just saying words and blah, 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 so I'm going through and talking like we would normally do. But what ends up happening is all our content words are nonsensical. It's just like sort of made up words. It's sort of a word salad of things. I'm talking, so imagine if I was talking with you and right now it makes sense, but instead of me talking and making sense, I just threw in random words and sort of said it at the same pace and cadence and things like that. That's kind of what Wernicke's aphasia looks like. And with Wernicke's, we see difficulty both with written speech or spoken speak and written speech. And what's interesting with Wernicke's aphasia, and you'll see this in this video, oftentimes people don't realize that their speech is impaired, right? So it would be if I were just talking, and I was just saying nonsense words the whole time. But in my mind, like it's clear as day. Yeah, I don't know, I'm talking to you. And all of a sudden people are asking me questions and I'm having a hard time comprehending what they're saying and sort of not realizing that what I'm saying is not making sense. And so we see difficulties recognizing that language is impaired. So again, language comprehension, responding, I'm kind of doing stuff, but it's not sort of on point and sort of following or tracking sort of the interview. And you'll see this in this video here when you go through, watch it again. I'll send you the links. But again, interesting to see if we have damage in sort of very close but distinct areas, we see very different patterns of deficits in speech. And these types of studies is one of the ways we've started to identify sort of how certain areas of the brain are functioning in sort of different areas and things.
Dr. Clapp,
Yeah.
question. You said with case 2 here that people who are affected also have trouble like comprehending other people's speech.
Mm-hmm.
Is that the same in case 1 or is this?
Nope. Case 1 is fine, and you'll see this. This poor young woman, I think, had a stroke, I think, and sort of damaged the Broca's area. And she knows, right? She's very frustrating. She's aware that she has deficits and perfectly understands questions being asked. It's just the production of speech has been disrupted because of that. Now, these are two kind of special cases. In general, I have a friend, one of my good friends is a neuropsychologist, and generally when we see this stuff, it's not as discrete as this. Usually, I'll have maybe a head injury and it damages my left sort of hemisphere, and it gets a lot of stuff, and so we see kind of a mix and a match and things like that. Or maybe I have a stroke event that goes through and takes out and damages a number of things. So it's actually not overly common to see as specific deficits because trauma tends to be sort of bigger. But when we do see pinpoint stuff in this area, speech and language stuff, really, really highly sort of overemphasized in your left hemisphere, particularly in your sort of temporal and frontal lobes. All right. So yeah, I'll send out those links so you can go there. They're not long videos. You just kind of go through, you start to get a sense for what some of these deficits are. But if you have questions, go ahead and shoot those to me. Okay. All right. Going to finish up with your forebrain. These are going to be your subcortical structures. Okay. If we were to take that cortex cap off and look underneath, we would see a number of different structures that are still part of your forebrain, still part of that sort of that newer region of your brain, but they're just going to be occurring underneath that cortex. We got your hippocampus. Anybody tell me what your hippocampus is involved in? Memory. Okay. When you think about hippocampus, think memory. Okay. This is going to go through. If I knocked out your hippocampus, you would have a hard time consolidating memories. So your memory doesn't live in the hippocampus, right? It's not like there's a sort of a glowing bauble in your hippocampus that contains your entire history, but your hippocampus looks to be important for going through processing memories and then sending those out to be stored in other regions of the brain. Okay. We also have your amygdala down there. What's your amygdala relevant for?
Hormone regulation with the pituitary gland.
Not the amygdala. That's going to be sort of some hypothalamus stuff going on there. Anybody got amygdala?
Fear and aggression.
Fear and aggression. It's an emotion type of thing. And particularly sort of negative emotions, fear systems and things like that, but some other types of emotions. So amygdala is sort of central in terms of a processing station for that. Okay. Thalamus is like a relay station for sensory and movement. If I'm going through and sort of moving my hands around, sort of a lot of those signals being passed and forth, back and forth through your thalamus. And then your hypothalamus, this is involved in the regulation of your autonomic nervous system, your endocrine system. This is organizing basic behaviors for survival. So things like fighting, eating, things like mating, fight or flight types of behavior going on in your hypothalamus. Okay, so when we're thinking about your limbic system, thinking about this collection of structures being involved in learning and memory, subjective emotion, recognizing emotion in other people, things along these lines. Okay. And then the last system here, or the last structure here, we'll talk about in your forebrain is going to be your basal ganglia. Basal ganglia is a collection of different structures involved in the control of movement. And so individuals with Parkinson's disease, we see deficits or sort of damage in some of these structures in the basal ganglia. So just thinking about your basal ganglia as a sort of a mechanisms or structures that are helping with the smooth regulation of movement and things along these lines. Okay. All right. We'll stop there. We'll pick up with just the reticular formation and just these last couple of slides on Wednesday. But any questions about nervous system, forebrain types of thing, anything along those lines? Basal ganglia is for coordination of smooth muscle movement, right? Again, if you think about, I don't know, someone, is Parkinson's is it a deficit in dopamine? What's that? In Parkinson's? I think Parkinson's is a dopamine deficit. So there's some neural pathways related to dopamine within your basal ganglia, and if those start to become problematic, you get sort of involuntary shakes and movements and things along these lines. And so just think about basal ganglia as sort of smooth muscle movement regulation stuff. Other questions about lecture, about anything else that you may have concerns in terms of course stuff, research, anything along those lines? Yeah.
So I don't know whether or not this is true or not, but I've heard that certain regions in your body have additional neurons that sometimes act in psychosomatic ways. Like apparently there's lots of extra neurons in the gut that can give you what they call gut feeling. Is that true or just?
I'm not sure. And so again, Court, this is where it starts to get tricky because we hear things like, so this specific thing, I'm not actually sure whether or not, your gut has a lot of stuff going on just because it's important because it's processing food for you and things along those lines. But I think the trick and it's subtle, right? The risk of falling in back, I get sort of butterflies in my stomach because my stomach has sort of more neurons or things like that. Sort of this want to try and make a one-to-one tie between physiology and then my psychological experiences and things. Okay. And it's telling me my internet connection is unstable. But so the thing, it could be true, but I would just say anytime you hear like, oh, this is the brain region that's involved in alcohol or alcohol use or something along those lines, be very careful because it's probably a gross oversimplification of how the system actually works. Again, sort of this mind-body question of the connection between sort of what our brain is doing and what we experience psychologically and emotionally and things along those lines is incredibly complex. There's a whole philosophical debate about this stuff. Now, by definition, if I'm looking at you all and I'm sort of thinking about sort of what you're doing, I'm processing sort of looks on your faces and things like that, at some level, that's all biological, right? Like if my neurons aren't firing, nothing happens, right? But how sort of those electrical signals in the brain are translated into behaviors and sort of internal experiences and consciousness is a very, very complicated, and we just don't know a whole lot about it, right? And so sometimes there's going to be things like, oh, sort of these are the pathways, the connections, and things along those lines. That's pretty interesting, but we always have to make sure that we're taking that stuff with a grain of salt, right? What'll happen a lot of times is, like, particularly as people start to do more and more like imaging behavior, or like sort of fMRI types of things, and say, oh, well, I had someone do this thing and this sort of portion of their brain lit up, so that portion of the brain is involved in sort of whatever, right? But if you go through and you look at studies, the same portion of the brain lights up when people do a lot of different stuff. And so it starts to become less interesting if the same portions of the brain always light up no matter what you're doing. And so you just want to make sure that you're informed consumers of some of this and recognizing that people will have a tendency to oversimplify, like this part of the brain does this thing. In general, it's more complex than that. That was a long answer that I think Court probably didn't answer your question, but
Thank you, sir.
yeah, no worries. Any other questions?
I had a question.
Yeah. Yeah, Keely?
Yeah. So as we were talking about the left side of the brain and the hemisphere dealing with learning, comprehension, and all that stuff, is dyslexia on that side of the brain also?
Oh boy, yeah, no, that's yeah. So, I do not know. So dyslexia. Now we talk about dyslexia now as a dyslexia. They've kind of phased dyslexia out and sort of gone broader with and talk about this as reading disorders, right? And actually starts to get sort of pretty broad outside of just like letter number reversals and things along those lines. I'm not sure what the research looks like in terms of biological bases for reading disorders or dyslexia. And that's the thing, right? Like we would think like, okay, here's people who have a very specific difficulty with, I think I just froze. Everybody else seems to be frozen and I'm not. There we go. Did I freeze? Okay, well.
Yes, you did.
Okay, yeah.
Super frozen.
Yeah. Because I was talking. I was the only one moving. You all were frozen up. I'm like, this seemed like a me issue and not a you issue. But Keely, I think to your question, it seems like, right? Like, so we've got people with this specific difficulty. We should see some disorder in a certain area of the brain, and it's much more difficult than that. I'll go through and again, my wife is a school psychologist and sort of does a lot of this stuff. I'll talk with her and see if she knows kind of what sort of, if there are correlations between specific deficits in sort of areas of the brain and stuff like that with reading stuff. And I'll type that out and get it back to you. Other questions? Good questions.
Doctor?
Yeah.
So when we're talking about the two case studies with cortical damage, you have like a wider area of damage that say would cover both areas. Would the impairment kind of be broadly kind of a mix between the two, or would it be kind of more diverse?
Yeah. What you see with anything, right, Michael, as you might expect, if I've got broad damage, I'm just going to see much more deficits and sort of much more generalized stuff. And that's oftentimes what happens, right? And a lot of times it's, stroke events and things like that goes through and damages a sort of a big portion of your brain. And what you'll see is a lot, sort of a mixture of different types of impairment, sort of gross deficits and comprehension and expression and things along those lines. Yeah. So it's just a more severe type of thing. Anything else? All right, cool. Thanks, folks, for hanging in there. I'll go through and get this posted. Again, I'll stop sending you individual notifications that lectures have been posted. You can just assume that they'll be through that link. You can go through and get that. But I'm going to do some research on reading disorders and send that out. Make sure that you're going through and getting jumping on Sona, get an account, knock out that pre-screen, and then just start looking for other research opportunities that come up. Okay. Awesome, folks. All right. Hey, great seeing you. Have a good rest of your day. We'll catch you on Wednesday. Bye.